What if everything you know about Adam ends exactly where the real story begins? The Bible you've read gives you 3 chapters. The Ethiopian Bible gives you 4 entire books. And what happens in those hidden pages changes everything. Most people think they know Adam's story. Paradise, apple, exile, done. That's the version that made it into your Bible. But there's a reason the Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved 81 books while the rest of Christianity settled for 66. Those extra 15 books weren't lost. They were removed. And the most detailed, most disturbing account among them is the Book of Adam and Eve, also called the conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan. This isn't some fringe text discovered last week. It's a 6th century work translated from Arabic into Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia. And it's been sitting in Ethiopian monasteries for over 1,000 years, while the Western world told a much shorter story. First of all, thank you for choosing to spend these moments with me and religion as it is. In this channel, we'll discuss topics of all religions, always respecting everyone's faith and beliefs. If this topic interests you, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and turn on notifications to be alerted of all new videos posted. Thank you and enjoy. Here's what you need to understand right now. The Genesis account gives you the expulsion from Eden in a handful of verses. Adam and Eve eat the fruit, God banishes them, and suddenly Cain is killing Abel. Everything between the garden and the murder happens in narrative darkness. But the Ethiopian texts fill that void with excruciating detail. They describe what happened the moment Adam and Eve stepped outside paradise. The fear, the confusion, the physical transformation as their bodies adjusted to mortality. They document Satan's relentless campaign to destroy humanity before it could even begin. And they reveal something that Western Christianity has completely ignored. Adam spent 930 years in a cave, fighting a spiritual war that makes modern religious struggle look like a minor disagreement. The Cave of Treasures becomes Adam and Eve's primary dwelling after Eden. Not a temporary shelter. Their home. The text describes how they entered this cave in desperation, seeking refuge from a world that had become hostile the instant they left paradise. Inside that cave, they faced temptation after temptation. Satan didn't vanish after the garden. He intensified. The Ethiopian account documents how Satan appeared to Adam and Eve in various forms, sometimes as an angel of light, sometimes as a fellow sufferer, always trying to finish what he started. He threw a boulder that trapped them inside the cave, attempting to crush them. God intervened, splitting the rock and comparing this moment of salvation to Christ's future resurrection. That's not metaphor. The text explicitly connects Adam's physical entombment and rescue to Jesus breaking free from the grave. Why would this matter enough to preserve in such detail? Because the Ethiopian tradition sees Adam's entire post-Eden existence as a prophetic template. Every suffering he endured prefigured something Christ would later experience. Every temptation Satan threw at Adam was preparation for understanding what Jesus would face. The Western Bible treats Adam's story as a cautionary tale about disobedience. The Ethiopian Bible treats it as the opening movement of a redemptive symphony that wouldn't reach its crescendo until Golgotha. You're probably wondering why these texts survived in Ethiopia but disappeared everywhere else. The answer is both simple and disturbing. When Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325, he wasn't gathering mystics to seek spiritual truth. He was assembling a political committee to standardize doctrine across a fragmenting empire. Unity requires uniformity. Uniformity requires elimination. The council examined dozens of gospels and texts circulating among early Christians. They chose some. They discarded others. The Gospel of Thomas, gone. The Gospel of Philip, erased. The Apocalypse of Moses, rejected. And the detailed accounts of Adam's life after Eden, deemed unnecessary. But Ethiopia was different. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church operated outside the direct control of Rome and Byzantium. Geography protected these texts. The rugged highlands, the linguistic barrier of Ge'ez, the fierce independence of Ethiopian Christianity, all conspired to preserve what the institutional church wanted gone. When European scholars finally encountered these manuscripts in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were stunned. James Bruce brought copies from Abyssinia to Europe. Archbishop Lawrence published the first English translation in 1838. August Dillman produced a more accurate German edition in 1851. And suddenly, Western scholarship had to confront a massive gap in their understanding of early Christian thought. The conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan doesn't read like the polished, edited prose of canonical scripture. It reads like testimony. Raw, repetitive, obsessively detailed testimony. Book 1 focuses almost entirely on Adam and Eve's psychological and spiritual collapse outside paradise. The text describes their confusion about basic survival. They didn't know they needed to eat until they nearly starved. They didn't understand sleep until exhaustion forced them into unconsciousness. Everything that felt natural in Eden required conscious effort in exile. The text documents their attempts to pray, their desperate pleas for God to let them return, and God's consistent refusal coupled with promises of future redemption. Satan's characterization in these texts is far more developed than anything in Genesis. He's not a snake who whispers and vanishes. He's a persistent, creative adversary who studies his targets and adapts his approach. When direct temptation fails, he tries deception. When deception fails, he tries violence. When violence fails, he tries despair. One passage describes Satan appearing to Adam disguised as an angel, claiming that God had forgiven them and they could return to paradise. Adam nearly believed him. Only divine intervention revealed the deception before Adam walked into another trap. This pattern repeats throughout the text. Satan offering false hope, false solutions, false versions of redemption, always trying to corrupt humanity before it could fulfill its purpose. The theological framework becomes clearer when you see how the text handles prophecy. God doesn't just punish Adam and Eve, He teaches them. He explains why the exile was necessary. He describes the coming Messiah in specific terms. He tells Adam that 5,500 years after the fall, someone will come to restore what was lost. The number isn't arbitrary, it's precise. And when you trace Ethiopian chronology forward from Adam's creation, it lands almost exactly on the birth of Christ. The Ethiopian texts treat history as a countdown, with Adam's suffering serving as the opening chapter of a story that wouldn't conclude until Calvary. Book 2 shifts focus to Adam's descendants but maintains the same theological intensity. The sons of God, mentioned cryptically in Genesis chapter 6, are identified explicitly as Seth's descendants. The daughters of men are Cain's line. The text describes how Satan manipulated Cain's descendants into creating music, weapons, and seductive culture specifically designed to lure Seth's righteous children down from their mountain refuge into the corrupt valley below. A man named Canon, son of Lamech, becomes the primary agent of this corruption. He invents musical instruments not for worship but for seduction. He develops weapons not for hunting but for warfare. The text portrays pre-flood civilization as a deliberate satanic project to pollute humanity so thoroughly that God would have no choice but to destroy it. This interpretation matters because it reframes the flood. In the standard reading, God gets angry at human wickedness and drowns everyone except Noah. In the Ethiopian reading, Satan nearly succeeded in making humanity irredeemable, and God preserved the last uncorrupted family specifically to continue the plan that started with Adam. Noah isn't just a righteous man. He's the carrier of Adam's mission, and that mission involves something physical. When Adam dies, his body isn't simply buried and forgotten. The text describes elaborate preparation. His body is embalmed and placed in the cave of treasures alongside gold, frankincense, and myrrh that Adam and Eve had brought from Eden. Yes, the same three gifts the wise men later bring to Jesus. Noah takes Adam's body onto the ark. After the flood, Melchizedek, guided by an angel, carries Adam's remains to a specific location described as the middle of the earth, to a hill called Cranium. You know it as Golgotha. The rock opens by itself, receives Adam's body, and closes. Centuries later, Roman soldiers hammer a cross into that exact ground. The second Adam dies directly above the first Adam. This isn't symbolic language that could mean anything. It's a specific, physical claim about geography and intention. The Ethiopian tradition insists that Christ's crucifixion location was chosen before Adam died. that Adam's body was transported across centuries specifically to be buried at the site of humanity's redemption. Western theology talks about Christ as the second Adam in metaphorical terms. Ethiopian theology makes it literal. The first Adam's body fertilizes the ground where the second Adam's blood falls. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like elaborate mythology, stories that grew in the telling until they became unrecognizable. But that assessment misses something crucial. The Ethiopian Church didn't treat these texts as mythology, they treated them as history. These accounts were copied, preserved, illuminated, and integrated into liturgical practice for over 1,500 years. The manuscript tradition shows careful transmission, not wild elaboration. When European scholars compared different Gaze manuscripts, they found remarkable consistency. This wasn't a game of telephone that distorted the message. This was institutional preservation of texts the Ethiopian Church considered essential. The question isn't whether these events happened exactly as described. The question is why this version of Adam's story mattered so much to early Christians that some communities built their entire theological framework around it, while others systematically eliminated it. What was at stake in telling Adam's story this way versus the abbreviated Genesis version? Part of the answer lies in what these texts do for believers. The Genesis account leaves you with guilt and distance. You're separated from God because of something Adam did, and there's not much detail about how that separation felt or what it cost. The Ethiopian texts give you a roadmap of suffering that makes your own struggles comprehensible. When you read about Adam spending 9 centuries fighting the same temptations, experiencing the same doubts, crying out with the same desperation, it validates your experience. You're not weak for finding faith difficult. Adam found it difficult. You're not alone in feeling separated from the divine. Adam felt that separation more acutely than you ever will because he actually knew what paradise felt like. But there's something else happening in these texts. Something that explains both their preservation and their suppression. They decentralize religious authority. If you can read about Adam's direct relationship with God, his unmediated conversations, his personal revelations, you start wondering why you need institutional intermediaries. The detailed accounts of Adam's prayers, his questions, and God's responses create a template for individual spiritual practice that doesn't require priests or rituals or buildings. You just need the same honesty and desperation Adam brought to the Cave of Treasures. That's dangerous to any institution claiming exclusive access to the divine. And it might explain why these particular texts didn't survive the 4th century standardization. They were too detailed, too personal, too direct. They gave believers too much information about how to approach God without going through approved channels. Better to keep the story short. Paradise, sin, exile, redemption through institutional sacraments, clean, controlled, manageable. But Ethiopia kept the longer version, and in that longer version, Adam's fate isn't just exile and death. His fate is transformation through suffering into something that can bear the weight of prophecy. His body becomes the foundation stone of salvation. His cave becomes a template for spiritual warfare. His 930 years become a testimony that faith isn't a moment of decision, but a lifetime of persistent, exhausted, desperate clinging to promises you can't yet see fulfilled. The texts describe Adam's final days with the same obsessive detail they gave his first days outside Eden. He gathers his children. He explains what's coming. He tells them about the Messiah who will restore everything. He instructs them on how to preserve his body and where to take it. Then he dies, not in defeat, but in hope. The text makes clear that Adam dies believing in a redemption he'll never see in his lifetime, but trusts will come exactly as God promised. And this is where the Ethiopian version fundamentally diverges from how Western Christianity tells the story. Adam isn't just the man who fell. He's the first believer, the first person to trust God's promise of future redemption despite present suffering. He's not the villain of human history. He's the opening witness in a trial that won't reach its verdict until Christ rises from the dead, directly above Adam's bones, in the place Adam's descendants carried his body, knowing it mattered where the first man was buried. What happened in those 930 years between exile and death wasn't just survival. It was preparation. Preparation for Noah, for Abraham, for Moses, for David, For everyone who would need to understand that the gap between promise and fulfillment can span centuries, but the promise remains true. Adam lived almost a millennium in that gap, and according to the Ethiopian texts, he never stopped believing he'd be proven right. That's the story the institutional church decided you didn't need, but Ethiopia kept it anyway. And now we're going to explore exactly what else they preserved about Adam that changes everything you thought you knew about paradise, exile, and what it actually cost the first humans to survive outside Eden. Because the Cave of Treasures holds more than just Adam's suffering. It holds the blueprint for understanding why salvation required such a specific, physical, bloody solution to a problem that started with fruit and a conversation. The Ethiopian texts describe something that happens in the Cave of Treasures that Western Christianity completely erased. Adam and Eve don't just hide there from the elements and predators. They transform there. The cave becomes a laboratory for human consciousness learning to function outside paradise, and the experiments are brutal. Here's what the texts record. Every time Adam and Eve try to replicate something from Eden, it fails catastrophically. They attempt to worship the way they worshipped in the garden. Wrong. The presence they felt there doesn't manifest the same way here. They try to eat the way they ate in paradise. The food tastes like ash. They attempt to rest the way they rested before the fall. Sleep brings nightmares instead of peace. Everything that was effortless in Eden requires exhausting intentionality outside it. The Book of Adam and Eve documents their confusion in painful detail. They don't understand why prayer feels different. They can't comprehend why their bodies hurt when they never hurt before. They're baffled by hunger that doesn't satisfy and thirst that returns hours after drinking. The texts describe Adam standing outside the cave at dawn, watching the sun rise, weeping because he remembers when light didn't burn his eyes. But Satan isn't content letting them suffer naturally. The Ethiopian account records multiple assassination attempts that never made it into Genesis. The first one involves a boulder. Satan, still furious about his own fall and blaming Adam for his expulsion from heaven, rolls a massive stone to crush them while they sleep in the cave. God intervenes, splitting the boulder before impact. The text explicitly states that God uses this moment to prophesy about the resurrection, about a different stone that will be rolled away from a different tomb. Adam doesn't understand the prophecy. He just knows he almost died and God saved him. Then Satan tries deception. He appears as an angel of light, tells Adam that God sent him with a message. Return to the garden. You're forgiven. Just follow me. Adam, desperate and exhausted, almost falls for it. Eve actually starts following the fake angel before Adam pulls her back. The text describes the moment Adam realizes he nearly walked into a trap. His first encounter with lies designed to exploit his desperation for what he lost. He learns discernment the hard way. The pattern repeats. Satan appears as food when they're starving, as water when they're dying of thirst, as comfort when they're breaking under grief. Each time Adam has to choose between the immediate relief of the deception and the harder path of trusting God's actual provision. The Ethiopian texts don't present this as a few isolated incidents. This is daily warfare spanning decades. Why does this matter? Because it establishes something the sanitized version of the story never addresses. Spiritual maturity isn't instant. Adam doesn't leave Eden knowing how to recognize deception. He has to learn it through failure, through near misses, through slowly developed pattern recognition that costs him years of mistakes. The Cave of Treasures becomes his training ground, and the cave itself has properties that Western tradition completely lost. According to the Ethiopian texts, Adam brings 3 items from Eden: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The same 3 gifts the wise men will bring to Christ thousands of years later. Adam stores them in the cave. The texts suggest these aren't just valuable materials. They're fragments of paradise itself, physical anchors to what was lost, kept safe through generations until they can fulfill their prophetic purpose at the birth of the one who will reverse Adam's curse. This changes the meaning of those gifts entirely. They're not random, expensive presents. They're creation coming full circle. The gold that witnessed Adam's glory in Eden, witnessing God made flesh in Bethlehem. The frankincense that filled paradise, offered to the child who will open paradise again. the myrrh used in Adam's burial, prophesying the burial of the second Adam. The Ethiopian church preserved this connection. The Western church lost it. The texts describe something else that happens in the cave. Adam begins to prophesy, not immediately, not even in the first century of his exile, but gradually, through the accumulated weight of suffering and God's persistent instruction, Adam starts understanding patterns. He sees how his fall prefigures future events. He recognizes that his expulsion maps onto humanity's need for a way back. He understands, dimly at first, and then with increasing clarity, that his body matters in ways he can't fully articulate, but knows are crucial. This is why he gives specific instructions about his burial. This is why he tells his children exactly where his body must eventually rest. Adam doesn't know about Golgotha by name, but he knows, through revelation he receives in the Cave of Treasures, that the place of his burial will become the place of humanity's redemption. The texts record him explaining this to Seth, to Enosh, to each generation. Preserve my body, move it when necessary. But ultimately it must rest at the center. The center of what? Adam doesn't fully know. He just knows it matters. Now watch what the texts do with Eve. Western Christianity largely ignores her after the fall, except as mother of Cain and Abel. The Ethiopian tradition gives her a parallel journey of transformation that's equally detailed. Eve's suffering focuses differently than Adam's. Where Adam struggles with the loss of authority and purpose, Eve struggles with the corruption of creation itself. She watches plants wither that would have flourished in Eden. She sees animals kill each other when they were peaceful before. She experiences childbirth as agony when it would have been joy. The texts record her conversations with Adam about whether bringing children into this broken world is cruel. She argues that maybe they should stop reproducing, stop perpetuating the curse into new generations. Adam has to convince her that the promise of redemption requires continuation, requires children who will eventually produce the Messiah. Eve bears children not from instinct, but from faith in a promise she finds almost impossible to believe, while her body screams in labor. This isn't in Genesis. This is what Ethiopia preserved. The text describes a moment, roughly 100 years into their exile, when Eve stops speaking for 40 days. Just complete silence. Adam thinks she's dying. She's not dying. She's processing. She's reaching the point where she either breaks entirely or transforms into something that can survive brokenness. On the 41st day, she speaks again. The text records her words. I choose to believe the promise even though I cannot see how it could possibly come true. That's the hinge moment. That's when Eve stops being the woman who took the fruit and becomes the first person to demonstrate faith as choice rather than sight. The Ethiopian church recognized this. They preserved it. The Western church reduced her to cautionary tale about female weakness. The Cave of Treasures, in the Ethiopian telling, becomes more than shelter. It becomes the first church, the first place where humans consciously gather to seek God's presence despite feeling abandoned. The first location where prayer happens as discipline rather than natural overflow. The first site where worship costs something because it requires choosing to trust when everything visible suggests trust is foolish. Adam establishes patterns in the cave that will echo through every subsequent religious practice. He sets times for prayer, not because God requires schedules, but because humans outside paradise need structure to remember. He creates simple rituals, not because God needs performance, but because embodied creatures need physical actions to anchor spiritual realities. He teaches his children to approach God with specific postures and words, not because God is particular, but because humans are forgetful and form matters for forgetful beings. The texts suggest this is where liturgy begins, not in Sinai with Moses, in a cave with Adam, figuring out through trial and error how fallen humans maintain connection with a God they can no longer see clearly. Every element of later temple worship traces back to adaptations Adam makes in the Cave of Treasures. The Ethiopian church preserved this genealogy of practice. The streamlined Western narrative lost the origin story. And here's where it gets specific about Satan's strategy. The texts describe how Satan studies Adam's new patterns. He watches Adam pray at certain times. He observes the rituals taking shape. Then he creates counterfeits. He appears during prayer times with false visions. He mimics the rituals with subtle distortions. He offers spiritual experiences that feel profound but lead nowhere. Adam has to learn discernment all over again. How do you tell the difference between God's presence and demonic imitation when both produce strong feelings? The Ethiopian texts record Adam developing tests. Does this experience make me more dependent on God or more self-sufficient? Does this vision align with what God already revealed or contradict it? Does this spiritual feeling produce patience and endurance or demand immediate gratification? These aren't abstract theological questions. These are survival skills Adam develops through decades of being deceived, correcting course, and slowly building a framework for testing spirits. The New Testament letters will later command believers to test everything. Adam wrote the original manual in a cave, learning through brutal experience what his descendants would need to know. The texts place special emphasis on how Adam teaches his children. He doesn't hide his failures. He explicitly tells them about every time Satan fooled him, every mistake he made, every moment he nearly gave up. This becomes the pattern for how spiritual knowledge transmits in the Ethiopian tradition. Not through pretending perfection, but through honest testimony about failure and recovery. Not through claiming authority, but through demonstrating vulnerability. Western Christianity often presents spiritual leadership as having all the answers. The Ethiopian Adam tradition presents it as honestly sharing the questions and the costly process of finding answers. Adam doesn't know everything. He's figuring it out in real time. But he tells his children what he learned so they can start from his hard-won wisdom instead of from zero. The Cave of Treasures, by the time Adam dies there, has become saturated with almost a millennium of prayer, suffering, instruction, and transformation. The texts suggest the cave itself becomes holy through use, not because the rock changes, but because what happens in the rock creates spiritual significance. This matters for understanding why Adam's body stays there for generations before Noah moves it. The cave and the body belong together. Both are witnesses to what survival outside paradise actually required. Human consciousness learning to function without direct access to God. That's what the Cave of Treasures documents. And it's precisely what happens in every human life after Adam. We're all doing what Adam did, trying to maintain connection with a God we can't see clearly, developing practices that anchor us when feelings fail, learning to recognize counterfeit spiritual experiences, choosing to trust promises we can't verify. Adam's 930 years in and around that cave are the template for how this works. Ethiopia preserved the instruction manual. The question is whether anyone's still reading it. The family dynamics emerging from that cave reveal something Western Christianity consistently sanitizes. Cain and Abel aren't just names in a genealogy. They're the first brothers raised by parents who lost paradise because of a choice. And the texts don't hide what that does to a family system. Adam tells his sons about Eden. He describes fruit that satisfied every hunger, water that tasted like light, air that felt like being held. He explains what he had and what he threw away. Now imagine being Cain or Abel, listening to your father describe perfection you'll never experience because of his failure. The resentment that builds isn't simple. It's layered with grief for something you never had, but know existed. The Ethiopian texts suggest Adam tries different approaches to parenting. Sometimes he's stern, emphasizing obedience as the lesson he learned too late. Other times he's permissive, almost paralyzed by guilt over what his choice cost his children. Neither approach works consistently. He's inventing parenthood without a model, raising kids in a hostile world, while carrying trauma no human before him ever faced. Eve's role gets more attention in these texts than Western tradition typically gives her. She's not just the silent partner in Adam's story. She's processing her own failures separately. The texts describe her teaching her daughters practical skills for survival, plant identification, food preparation, basic medicine. But she also carries something Adam doesn't. She remembers the serpent's voice more clearly. She's the one who actually spoke with the deceiver, who felt the full force of that manipulation, who carries the memory of being the entry point for death into human experience. That creates a specific kind of wound. Adam failed by following Eve's lead. Eve failed by trusting Satan's words. Their shame has different textures, and the texts suggest this difference sometimes creates distance between them. Moments where Eve withdraws into silence that Adam can't penetrate. Moments where Adam's frustration at their situation comes out as subtle blame. He doesn't quite speak, but she definitely feels. This isn't a marriage book, but it's documenting the first marriage under impossible conditions. Two people trying to maintain partnership while both carrying catastrophic regret, raising children in a world that fights them daily, missing a home they can never return to. The fact that they stay together for 9 centuries is itself a theological statement about commitment that Western Christianity largely ignores in favor of Eden romance narratives. Now, the murder. Western tradition gives you maybe 10 verses about Cain killing Abel. The Ethiopian texts spend extensive time on the buildup, the psychological deterioration that makes fratricide possible. The issue starts with offerings. Both brothers bring sacrifices. God accepts Abel's, rejects Cain's. Western tradition tends to explain this through sacrifice quality or heart attitude. The Ethiopian texts add details about Satan's involvement. He doesn't just watch the brothers. He actively works on Cain's mind, amplifying the rejection, twisting it into a narrative about unfairness and favoritism. But here's what the texts emphasize that Western Christianity often misses. Cain's resentment isn't primarily about God. It's about inheritance. Cain is the firstborn. In every cultural system Adam knows that means something. Primacy, leadership, special status. But God's acceptance of Abel's offering suggests merit matters more than birth order. That threatens Cain's entire identity. Satan exploits this specific vulnerability. He frames Abel's acceptance as theft of what rightfully belongs to Cain. He suggests that Adam and Eve secretly favor Abel. He plants thoughts about what will happen when Adam dies. Who gets the cave? Who becomes the spiritual leader? Who carries the promises God made about redemption coming through their family line? The texts describe Cain becoming obsessed with these questions. He stops sleeping properly. He watches Abel constantly, interpreting every interaction as evidence of conspiracy. Adam notices something's wrong, but doesn't have the framework to recognize psychological breakdown. There's no precedent for mental illness. Cain's the first human to experience it. The actual murder happens during harvest time. They're alone in a field. The text suggests Satan appears to Cain one more time, not as himself, but as an angel of light, and gives what sounds like divine permission. You're restoring proper order. You're taking back what's yours. God will understand. Cain picks up a rock. The text specifies it's the same type of rock Satan once used trying to kill Adam and Eve. There's intentional symbolism there. The weapon that failed against the parents succeeds against the son. Abel's blood hits the ground and immediately the earth reacts. The texts describe the soil literally recoiling, refusing to absorb the blood. It pools on the surface, crying out. This isn't metaphor in the Ethiopian tradition. It's describing a physical phenomenon, the earth's first contact with human violence, creating a permanent change in how the ground functions. God confronts Cain with the question everyone knows. Where is your brother? Cain's response, "Am I my brother's keeper?" reveals something the texts emphasize. He's not just deflecting. He's genuinely confused. In Cain's distorted thinking, shaped by months of Satan's whispers, he really did have the right to do this. He's asking the question sincerely. Was I actually responsible for him? The curse that follows does something specific. God tells Cain the ground will no longer yield crops for him. He'll become a wanderer. But there's a detail the texts add. The curse isn't just punishment, it's protection. Cain's been marked, but not in the way Sunday school teaches. The mark isn't visible. It's a spiritual signature that prevents anyone from killing him. Because if someone did, they'd unleash a cycle of vengeance that would destroy the human race before it could populate the earth. Adam and Eve learn about Abel's death through divine revelation before they find the body. The texts describe Eve's immediate knowledge. a mother's intuition amplified by proximity to the spiritual realm they're not fully separated from yet. She starts running toward the field before Adam understands what's happening. When they find Abel, the texts don't spare details. The violence of the first murder, the condition of the body, Eve's collapse, Adam's realization that death has now touched his family directly. Not the gradual death of aging they've been experiencing. Sudden, violent, irreversible death. They have to figure out what to do with a body. There's no cultural knowledge about burial. The texts describe God sending an angel to show them how to prepare Abel for the ground. They learn funeral rites by divine instruction, creating practices that will continue for millennia. Abel's buried near the Cave of Treasures. His grave becomes the second sacred site in the Ethiopian tradition. The cave where Adam wrestles with God and spiritual formation. The grave where death first demonstrated its power over human flesh. The aftermath devastates the family in ways that fragment the narrative. Cain leaves. That's obvious. But the texts describe how Adam and Eve's other children start taking sides. Some sympathize with Cain, suggesting Abel must have done something to provoke it. Others demonize Cain completely, refusing to speak his name. Adam tries to hold the family together while processing his own failure. He taught his sons about God. He modeled sacrifice. Somehow, that teaching produced murder. Eve stops speaking for a period the texts measure in months. Not selective silence, complete muteness. She performs necessary tasks, but won't engage verbally with anyone. Adam has to communicate with her through gestures and written symbols they develop. The trauma has literally stolen her voice. Seth's birth happens in this context. He's not just another son. He's the replacement for Abel, the new carrier of the promise, the one through whom the line will continue. The texts suggest Adam's relationship with Seth is complicated by this pressure. He's trying not to repeat mistakes with Cain while also investing Seth with significance that no child should have to carry. But Seth grows up different. Maybe because he's born into a family already marked by tragedy. Maybe because Adam's parenting has evolved through brutal experience. The texts describe Seth as naturally inclined toward spiritual things, asking questions about Eden, wanting to understand God's nature, showing none of Cain's resentment about being born outside paradise. Seth becomes Adam's primary student. The knowledge transfer that happened casually with Cain and Abel becomes systematic with Seth. Adam teaches him everything about spiritual warfare, about recognizing Satan's tactics, about maintaining faithfulness when feelings fail. Seth learns from Adam's mistakes instead of having to make them all himself. This is where the Ethiopian tradition's emphasis on generational knowledge transfer becomes explicit. Seth isn't just learning religion. He's learning survival skills for spiritual warfare that will keep his descendants alive through the centuries before the flood. The texts describe Adam as increasingly urgent about this teaching. He's aging. He knows his time is limited. Everything he learned through 9 centuries of painful experience has to compress into Seth's education. The genealogies that follow Seth aren't just names. They're a succession of knowledge carriers. Each generation receives the teaching, tests it against their own experience, adds what they learn, passes it forward. The Ethiopian texts track this transmission with unusual detail, naming not just the patriarchs but the specific teachings each one emphasized. Enoch receives something different. The texts describe him as the culmination of this knowledge lineage, the one who pushes beyond what Adam taught into direct mystical experience. He doesn't just learn about spiritual warfare. He gets taken into the heavens to see how reality actually works. The Ethiopian tradition treats Enoch's ascension as the payoff for generations of faithful transmission. Adam's teaching created a foundation strong enough that one of his descendants could handle direct encounter with the divine architecture of existence. But Adam doesn't live to see Enoch's ascension. The texts track his decline with clinical precision. He passes 800 years, then 850. His body begins failing in ways that reveal he was never meant to be immortal in flesh. The original design included death as transition, not punishment. Sin just made that transition catastrophic instead of natural. Adam's final years focus on preparing for what comes next. He knows his body will die. The question is what happens to the knowledge? The gold from Eden, the sacred objects they've carried for 9 centuries. He organizes everything. The texts describe him creating what amounts to an archive in the Cave of Treasures. Specific instructions for who inherits what. Detailed accounts of every encounter with God, every lesson learned, every mistake made. Eve's still alive during this preparation. The texts suggest she's more pragmatic about death than Adam is. She's been dying spiritually since Abel. Physical death feels like completion rather than catastrophe. But she helps Adam with the organization because she knows the information has to survive. Their experiences can't die with them. The death scene itself is remarkably understated. No dramatic final words. No deathbed prophecy. Adam simply stops breathing after 930 years of continuous consciousness. The texts note that Eve touches his face to confirm he's gone. Then begins the burial preparation they learned from the angel centuries earlier after Abel died. Here's where the Ethiopian tradition diverges most dramatically from anything in Western Christianity. Adam's body doesn't just get buried and forgotten. It becomes a sacred object that travels through history. The texts describe Eve and Seth embalming the body using techniques God teaches them specifically for this purpose. They wrap it in burial cloths. They place it in the Cave of Treasures with the gold, frankincense, and myrrh from Eden. But that's not where it stays. When Noah builds the ark, the texts say he takes 3 things from the cave before the waters come: the gold, the incense, the myrrh, and Adam's embalmed body. These objects survive the flood not because Noah's sentimental, but because they're prophetically necessary. They're part of a pattern that won't complete for thousands of years. After the flood, Melchizedek receives instructions. He's told to take Adam's body, along with Shem and an angel guide, to a specific location. The texts call it the middle of the earth, the center point of creation, the place where heaven and earth intersect most directly. We know it by another name: Golgotha, the hill of the skull. The rock opens by itself. Melchizedek places Adam's body inside. The rock closes. The location becomes a tomb centuries before it becomes a crucifixion site. And when Christ is eventually crucified there, the blood runs down through the rock to where Adam's bones rest. The second Adam's blood literally covers the first Adam's remains. The Ethiopian texts make this connection explicit. Redemption happens at the exact geographic point where death first took permanent hold. This is why the tradition matters. Not because it's provably historical in every detail, because it understands something Western Christianity often misses. The story has to be embodied, physical, geographic. Adam's not just a theological concept. He's a body that travels through time until it reaches the moment when another body can undo what his disobedience initiated. The genealogical sections that follow Adam's death aren't boring lists. They're tracking the knowledge transmission. Each patriarch receives specific teachings, tests them against reality, adds their own insights, passes the accumulated wisdom forward. The line from Adam to Noah to Abraham to David to Christ isn't just biological descent. It's intellectual and spiritual inheritance. The Ethiopian texts include details absent from Genesis. They name the wives. They describe specific challenges each generation faced. They track how the teaching evolved as circumstances changed, but core truths remained constant. By the time you get to Christ, you're not seeing a random appearance of divinity. You're seeing the culmination of a process that started when Adam first learned to resist Satan in the cave. The Pearl legend captures this perfectly. Ethiopian tradition says God placed something in Adam at creation, a divine essence that would pass through generations, purifying with each transfer until it reached perfect form in Mary. This isn't biological determinism. It's recognition that spiritual reality has material consequences. The incarnation required preparation, not just theological preparation, physical, genealogical, embodied preparation stretching back to the first human. That's what Ethiopia preserved, while the rest of Christianity told a shorter, safer story. Adam wasn't just the man who fell and died. He was the first person to learn what faith costs when you can't see the outcome. 930 years of choosing to believe a promise that wouldn't be fulfilled in his lifetime. teaching his children to carry knowledge forward, watching his body become part of a plan he'd never fully understand. His bones rest under Golgotha because redemption required that specific connection. The first Adam's failure and the second Adam's victory happening at the exact same coordinates. Western tradition made this metaphorical. Ethiopia kept it physical, and maybe that's why these texts survived in Ethiopian monasteries while disappearing everywhere else. They're too concrete, too detailed, too insistent that the story has weight and location and bodies that matter across millennia. You can't reduce this version to simple morality tales. It demands you see salvation as something that required 9 centuries of preparation in a cave before it could happen on a cross. Adam's fate wasn't just exile and death. It was becoming the foundation, literally and theologically, for everything that came after.